And this is one of the papers, one of the chapters of my thesis, of the PhD thesis. And of course, as all the PhD theses, they're never done on your own, but they were done in collaboration with my supervisors. So part of the merit goes to Professor Antonella Palumbo, that the option from Rome should know. There's option from Rome that I should know some people, ciao. And partially it was done in collaboration with Professor Jonathan Marie from Università Sorbonne Nouvelle, that you should get to know this year while you're here. And one of you will end up doing his PhD, his master thesis with him for sure, so good luck. And no, we can proceed with the motivation. So as, maybe with the title. So I'm here today to talk about a heterodox explanation of inflation. And of course, I have to motivate why I got there. So there will be like a little short parenthesis of how we turned towards that direction. So the motivation was the fear of inflation. You can see from this very simple table that reports harmonized index of consumer prices in euro area, that at least from 97, 98, that even from before, inflation was not a thing in Europe, at least in the euro area. And curiously enough, when I picked the topic of studying inflation, inflation was really not a thing at all. It was almost deflationary period. And the reason why I was personally interested in the topic was because even in a moment so not relevant for inflation, because there was not inflation, at least in the euro area, inflation was still everywhere. It was in the textbook, it was in the newspapers, it was always the most discussed topic, and the policymakers and various institutions, they were all using this fear of inflation to try to justify not to adopt expansionary policies and try to keep the economy cool, let's say. And even in the moments of recession or crisis, so after the financial crisis, when really there was no reason to fear inflation, even moments like that, there was still this instrumentalization of inflation for the fear that the economy would overheat and stuff like that. So I was very curious why this was the case, and I guess the most basic naive explanation would be in the theoretical understanding of the mainstream economics of how we see inflation and its causes. So inflation is always seen as a result of a departure from the labor market from a unique point of equilibrium. And everything has to be done to reestablish this equilibrium. So let's go to the second step. Most of the time, to talk about inflation, again, newspapers, policymakers, institutions, and academia itself refer to the Phillips curve and to different kind of models with the Phillips curve. And most of you should know from a long time ago what the Phillips curve is, but at least from in the mainstream understanding, in the short run, the Phillips curve is some kind of a trade-off relationship. It's a inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment, or different variables that are a proxy for inflation and unemployment. And it's used as a very specific tool in policymaking to sometimes suggest to maybe increase unemployment to reduce inflation, or vice versa. In the long run, in the same theoretical context, the Phillips curve becomes vertical, and we don't consider this trade-off anymore, but we consider that there is one specific equilibrium level of unemployment, and the economy goes back to this point, and any deviation from it would be inflationary. So, what are the consequences of this reasoning? And the consequences are that usually then causes of inflation are considered as caused by an overheated economy. So there's probably an excess demand for labor and not enough supply, which means also that there's probably an excess of supply of money, excessive government spending, and the interest rate is too low. So then as consequence come the cures, and the most obvious solutions are austerity measures, which can increase unemployment, slow down the economy, and bring the inflation back to a stable level. And this is very important, even if it's very obvious, because it's still today in most of the debates, and it comes back all the time. And one of the funniest moments is during the last inflation surge. There was this quote from Larry Summers, which was Obama's economic advisor, who was suggesting, as the inflation was rising, that the best way to cool down US economy was either to have 5 years on unemployment around 5%, or maybe 2 years of 7.5% of unemployment rate, or even 1 year of 10% of unemployment. And it was like an automatic suggestion, like, oh, yes, we do this and everything will be solved. And it's funny because this was not done, but inflation still came down, thanks God. And this creates in economics a sort of puzzle. Each time the theory is not confirmed by reality, we call it a puzzle. And the funny thing, again, is that it's not the first inflation puzzle, but there's many puzzles that come in relation to the Phillips curve. So in my work, I also very quickly looked at different puzzles previous to this last wave of inflation. Some of them were concerning the inflation puzzle of post-Great Recession. So it was a moment of crisis, unemployment started increasing, so automatically you would expect that inflation was starting to decrease, but this did not happen. And so this was the puzzle of missing deflation. And many authors, I'm just going to go very quickly through this, but many authors started worrying, and they were talking about that they worry that the Phillips curve might be broken, or it might be, it probably has been killed by someone, or maybe it's dead, or it might resurrect or disappear. It was very beautiful to read, but also very confusing, like why they were all looking for it. And what was very important point for me as a starting point is that to understand that whenever they were talking about the Phillips curve, they were never talking about one specific Phillips curve. Yes, it was a mainstream Phillips curve, but mainstream Phillips curve means many, many things. It's like thousands, millions of models, and they can be extended with different variables, with different specifications, different lags, I don't know, many, many, many things. So one thing that I did was to schematize at least some of the main historical models chronologically with some additions of explanations. But I'm not going to go through all of them, don't worry. But the main part, the most important point that I want to explain is that it all started from very long time ago, from 1958 work from Phillips, and who invented the Phillips curve, surprise. And it's very important to remind us today that it was a completely, not a completely, but it was a different result. So this was the result of an econometric exercise. So it was not a theory trying then to be confirmed in data, but the contrary. It was something found in data. The data were UK data from 1861 to 1913. So it was like a long-term relationship found in data, and then theorized that maybe if we look at such a long period, and we find this inverse decreasing relationship between unemployment rate and, in his case, it was rate of change of money wages, we find this direction, let's say. And so for very, very low levels of unemployment, we will have much faster growing rates of change of money wages. And another important thing to mention is even when Phillips presented these results, he didn't think that they were like the truths that will last forever, but they were just referring to the UK example. And he also admitted that probably there was like a series of other explanations that could somehow be connected to this relationship that we should consider. So going very quickly back to all the other curves, basically very fast the other models detach from the original story, and each of them, at least from those that are reported but also those that are not reported in the table, they were like coming one after the other trying to solve some of the problems of which of the models. So the 1960s Phillips curve, the second one in the table, was an attempt to try to take original Phillips curve and embed it in like a more neoclassical theoretical framework. The accelerationist Phillips curve was a way to respond to all the problems that 1960s Phillips curve encountered, as many econometric results were never showing the Phillips curve, so they had to find a different way to talk about it to manage to find it again. The triangle model was responding to the need of the 70s to deal with supply shocks because there were all the oil crises. And the New Keynesian Phillips curve, maybe one of the more famous right now, was a way to, again, embed new theoretical content in it. So I'm not going to deal with it, don't worry, but the point is that looking at these puzzles, there were also authors that were declaring Phillips curve dead, and they were doing it not to one specific model among those that I showed you, but each time they were referring to a different model. So none of the Phillips curve that I was mentioning were alive somehow. And then there was also the other side of people that were declaring the Phillips curve alive, but in order to declare it alive, they had to do through a series of tests and changes. So maybe they started from an expectation augmented Phillips curve, and then they had to shift to a New Keynesian Phillips curve in order to prove that it existed. Maybe they had to change the variable that we were using or the time they were analyzing. Each time there were modifications. Maybe they started with a very complex model. They couldn't find the Phillips curve, so they shifted to a much simpler model and managed to find the Phillips curve and stuff like that. The same puzzle, not the same, but a similar puzzle was found also in the recovery from the Great Recession. So unemployment started going down. We expected inflation to go up. And so we had the missing reinflation puzzle. Again, Phillips curve could not be found in the work of many authors, and so new instruments were invented. Like, for example, let's shift from national level data to regional level data. Let's shift from regional level data to city level data until we find the Phillips curve at least somewhere. Another interesting example was Blanchard in 2016 declared that the Phillips curve was not working anymore, and his proposal was shifting back to 1960s. So not the original, but the second one that maybe should work compared to the others. So in all of this mess, I was very disappointed, and I understood that all the results were just varying based on the sample of the period, on the variables used, on the econometric specifications, and it was a big push to go and look what was happening on the heterodox side of the story. And no matter what was the specification and no matter what was the Phillips curve that we briefly discussed, some main assumptions still were the same. Like inflation was still most of the time considered a demand pull phenomena, and it was still very related to this unemployment rate of equilibrium, from which inflation was caused if you deviated from it. There was still like a reference to the excess aggregate demand and full capacity of the economy. There was some references also to cost push inflation, but usually it was considered as a temporary phenomena that will solve itself out thanks to market adjustments, and just like parentheses that we should not take seriously into account. So we survived the first motivation part, and finally this moved us to consider the heterodox explanation of inflation. But which brings us to the research question, which is, what are the most relevant interpretations of the causes of inflation in the heterodox literature? The difficulty here was to look at various heterodox contributions and manage to find something coherent, something explainable. And the first step of difficulty was to define heterodox, because heterodox economics could be many schools of thought, many approaches, you know it better than me, and they can have very different starting points and very different conclusions. They can have very different theoretical backgrounds. They do not not necessarily share the same core elements in the methodology. So just generalize and say heterodox economics was too vague. So when I will be referring to heterodox economics in the next steps, because the presentation is about this, do not think that I'm referring to everything possible that is alternative to mainstream economics, but still to some specific schools of thought that had some elements in common in the way they look at inflation and they interpret the causes of inflation. So there's three main elements that we decided were important to organize this literature. And the first element is that all the authors and contributions we take into account are considering inflation through a cost push approach. And they do not believe in the equilibrium of the labor market, and they do not believe in the natural rate of unemployment. Also, they believe that inflation cannot be caused by excess liquidity of money, and the supply of money is endogenous. And the most important part is that most of this explanation of inflation in heterodox works that we considered were basing their explanations of inflation on conflict over the income distribution. So, of course, we are not the first one that woke up and decided that we are going to do a great job and organize heterodox contributions about inflation. There's many works that I'm reporting here, but also many that you can find in the paper. And many authors already did similar work. But maybe the main difference is that all of us have a different scope and a different vision of what we're doing. So some authors did it based on maybe contrast between different schools of thought, or maybe between mainstream and heterodox. Some use like some organizing criteria, like for example, the vision of the causes of inflation, if inflation is demand pull or cost push. Others maybe looked directly, I have all this beautiful animation, others looked maybe specifically in one school of thought and maybe said, okay, within the Marxist interpretation, what are the different causes of inflation? Within the post-Keynesian interpretation, and then others that looked within the post-Keynesian interpretation and found like even more narrow debates to see what the results are. So all of these works were fundamental for our starting point, and they were super useful and good for our analysis. But what we wanted was something that is more simple and comprehensive. We wanted to be able to look at any, not at any, but to different papers that somehow treat inflation or conflict and be able to say where they belong and how to classify them, how to understand them easily. And at the end of the presentation, you will tell me if we did a good job or not. But in order to classify and compare all this material and all these contributions from heterodox economics that we defined in a specific way, we needed one organizing principle. And at the end, the principle that we chose was conflict. By conflict, we mean that there's a portion of income and the different groups are trying to reach a slice of it, and there could be different forms of this conflict. So this conflict is dependent on the groups that are involved in it, and there could be different groups. And of course, I'm going to describe the groups and the different types of conflict, but just to mention, we did not invent the different types of conflict. Like, they already exist in the literature, many authors refer to them. What we did is to reorganize them, simplify them, put them in a way that is intuitive and broader. So today we're going to discuss about 5 of them, and the main 5 that we identified were the conflict between workers and firms, conflict between domestic agents and foreign agents, conflict between workers and workers, firms, and at the end, financial and non-financial sector. By looking at literature, we still found like subsections and subdivision of all of this work, because, for example, workers and firms, it's one of the most discussed types of conflict, and it was a very broad material, and we had to subdivide it further. So, for example, we try to make a distinction between those models that do use a Phillips curve to study this type of conflict, and those models that do not use a Phillips curve. And within the models that do use a Phillips curve, we can find different types of Phillips curve. So there's like a decreasing one, a vertical, and a flat one. And we can see it later. So we can go directly to business and discuss the first type of conflict. So the first type of conflict is between workers and firms. And as I was saying, is probably the one most obvious that you should have already have heard about or done work about. It's already discussed by many big names all the way in the past, but we can say that the modern formalization of this model can be also connected to Rawthorne work in 1977. Rawthorne, in fact, describes that the income of the private sector has to be distributed between workers and firms, and each group has a different claims on it. The workers are trying to ask for higher wages, and the firms are trying to protect their profits and not allow the workers to take as high of wages as they are asking, because any distribution towards one group is coming at the expense of the other groups. And this causes a cost-push inflation. There's many contributions and many models that deal with this conflict, but even if they are different and they start from different points, they all have some points, some elements in common that also distinguish them from the mainstream approach. So one of these elements is the way they consider wage and distribution, which is not just decided by the markets or things like this, but they are exogenous variables that are decided historically by social and political context. So this is a very big difference from the previous approach. Also, this vision considers that inflation can exist even if there is still unemployment, while in mainstream economics you're usually saying that if there is inflation, it means that economy is already operating on full capacity, while here, if inflation is just a result of a conflict, it doesn't matter at which point unemployment is. It does matter in the way it distributes the power between the parts, the groups, but not on inflation. The role of demand is not direct as it is in mainstream economics, but it's indirect. So it's not starting the inflation, but it determines what is the power redistribution. And maybe one of the most important points that distinguishes from other approaches is that most of contributions consider that the inflation expectations are only partially incorporated into wages and prices, while usually in mainstream economics it's considered that the incorporation is total, and so whatever are the inflation expectations from the workers, they manage to somehow push it into wages and prices. So we were saying that workers and firms conflict can be described by a Phillips curve, and there's different types of Phillips curves. And so the most common is the decreasing one, and it's very similar to the original one. This is why I was bringing back the original Phillips curve, because somehow the heterodox tradition tries to go back to this original Phillips curve. And the trade-off between inflation and employment is related to the conflict between workers and firms. And of course, the results of who is getting the biggest size of income, let's say, depends on the strengths of this conflict. So if the workers' bargaining power is higher, in a specific historical moment, we will have something that is also called the wage price spiral, and the workers will manage to ask for higher wages and obtain them at the expense of the firms. And it's something that was very relevant in the 60s, 70s, maybe still 80s, when the workers' bargaining power was much higher than today, and they were actually able to achieve some of this what they demanded. While today, the bargaining power of workers is very, very low, and we have very low union rate. And this is one of the main explanations of why, even in heterodox economics, when they look for a Phillips curve, the Phillips curve is flat, because there's not more this relationship, because the workers don't have the strength to demand higher wages. However, when the workers' bargaining power is very low and the firms have more strength, let's say, and their market power is higher, we have the opposite, the price wedge spiral. And the firms are stronger and manage to increase prices by also protecting their profits and at expenses of workers. And this was very, very relevant in the last inflation surge, as there was this very, very active debate about the fact that probably firms all of a sudden got much market power and could increase prices more than expected. Again, among models with a Phillips curve, we also have maybe the most controversial one, the vertical Phillips curve. This is related to the heterodox models that do accept the existence of the NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Usually, it's something more common in mainstream economics, but there is still a branch of heterodox economics that does believe that the NAIRU can exist. And they call it with different names, but the idea is still the same. And some heterodox authors try to justify the existence of the NAIRU within the heterodox economics by saying that it's still the result of a conflict between workers and firms. So it's heterodox because it's the expression of the conflict. The vertical curve was already presented in Rawthorne work, so it goes as back at the same time as the decreasing Phillips curve. And in his idea, the vision was that as soon as unemployment rate decreases too much and goes to like a minimum level, there's a shift from a decreasing Phillips curve to a vertical Phillips curve, and inflation accelerates all of a sudden at a higher level of unemployment. There's many characteristics of this curve. For example, that in this case, the models rely on effective demand, while we were saying they usually don't for the other types of curves we were examining from a heterodox perspective. And this NAIRU, the heterodox NAIRU, is not an automatic mechanism that brings employment at the optimal level, while in mainstream economics usually it is. It's an attractor of this equilibrium level. And it also has, this NAIRU has an endogenous nature, so it depends on the level of unemployment, on the effective demand, on the output gap and other elements of the economy. It also does not represent for heterodox economies an optimal equilibrium, and does not correspond to full employment, as they don't believe in imperfect markets. There's many examples of this type of modeling, and there's also a very wide literature with critiques about these models, but we don't need to discuss it all right now. So the last type of Phillips curve models within the heterodox tradition is the flat Phillips curve, and it can be also seen as a complementary reaction, not complementary, the opposite reaction to what the vertical curve was representing. Because if the vertical curve was saying that there is one unique point that assures you to have a stable inflation, and any deviation from that point causes an acceleration. Here it's completely the opposite. There's three segments. The externals, the extremes are decreasing, and the central is a very flat segment. And so the flat part says that no matter which level of unemployment you're taking into account, it's not going to have any impact on inflation. But the extremes, yes, of course, like at very, very low or very, very high levels of unemployment. Many authors also deal with this kind of curve, and it is a direct critique to the previous one, to the vertical curve with a single Nairo. Okay, so we managed to finish the first description of the first conflict, and maybe the thing that I wanted to highlight that we don't have time to go very much in detail is that there are different types of Phillips curve, of course, decreasing, vertical, and flat, and they are all based on workers' firms conflict. But this relationship is not everything. So even if the heterodox economies do use this kind of models, they never stop and say this is the truth and the rule and everything is perfect like this. They do usually still go look for other variables and for other elements that could influence this relationship. So this could be variables that represent proxies of change in institutional setting or open economy variables, but there's always more. So they start maybe from a Phillips curve, but they go beyond it. And even those that do use a Phillips curve, openly sometimes are skeptical about it, and they like write openly about it, and they don't think that it's always valid and always stable over time. In fact, they report that it's a relationship that, as it's mediated by political, institutional, and cultural aspects, as this institutional and cultural aspects change, the relationship also changes, and also the size of the conflict can change based on the situation. So this brings us to a very interesting part that is smaller compared to the rest of the literature, but still very relevant, is that there are also authors that do believe in the workers' firms conflict, but they not necessarily have to explain it through the use of a Phillips curve. So one example is this paper from Bastien Charles-Marie from 2024, where they present an entire typology of different inflation regimes, and they start from a worker firms conflict, and they do have equations and explanation of how this relationship works, but they don't necessarily describe it with a standard Phillips curve, and they go beyond it. So finally, we can discuss a second type of conflict. So I promise that only the first one was much more detailed because it's the most discussed, but the others are much easier to describe and to present. And so when we refer to the domestic agents, foreign agents conflict, as you can imagine, also with the help of the picture, we refer to a situation where a country has external constraints in a globalized economy. And it's already a type of conflict that is very much described in detail by Latin American structuralist tradition, and it relates with three main factors that are like the triggers of the inflation in this conflict. So one of the most important is change in nominal exchange rate, as you would expect, as a country that has to import already final goods inside this country, the price of these goods will be much higher once the exchange rate changes, and also the production within the country with imported inputs is going to increase. And there's a series of authors that deal with it. Another important element when we talk about this kind of conflict and we look at this picture is increase in the international prices, and we think about it in a way that explains that if there is a country or a firm that has the possibility of controlling the price of finished goods or raw materials that the country or the firm owns, by having this power of controlling prices, this country or firm is already the one that is responsible for the shock. And so the country that will have to import these final goods or raw materials will have just to accept the imposed change of prices, and will also have to adapt the local prices to this change. And finally, in this type of literature, there's also the consideration, the discussion of the supply shocks. And of course, they can be caused by many variables, but some of them are supply chains disruptions, climate events, war events, political events, and things like that. The third type of conflict we have is the conflict between workers and workers, also called wage-wage spiral. And it's a type of conflict that was introduced by Richard Kahn. And he describes it as a conflict between different labor groups, and each group is trying to keep up with the increase in wages of the other group. So if there's one specific group that manages to bargain for higher wages and they obtain it, this will always happen at the expense of the other group that didn't obtain the same increase in wages. So the group left behind will always try to ask for higher wages, and this will perpetuate the conflict between the different groups of workers. These different groups of workers can be different trade unions or different groups within the same trade union. And also, according to this author, it could be the conflict between more skilled and better paid workers, or less skilled and less paid workers. Another way to look at this conflict is through the lenses of productivity and technical progress, but it's very similar. There's this understanding that if there's a sector with a higher productivity, the workers that are responsible for this higher productivity will then end up asking for higher wages that will be proportionate to their productivity gains. And so this will provoke the conflict from all the other groups from less productive sectors. They will also try to compensate from this deviation of wages. And so higher rate of technical progress will technically cause higher inflation within the wage-wage conflict. One of maybe more controversial and interesting in the last 2-3 years has been the firms-firms conflict. And it's the conflict either between firms in different sectors or firms that have different sizes. So for those authors that consider conflict between firms in different sectors, the reasoning behind it is that it's also called seller-induced inflation, and the reasoning is that when there is a supply shock, all the firms have to increase prices because the cost increases, but there are some sectors, specifically sectors that maybe are the most hit, the most interested by this supply shock, the most damaged, that can afford to increase prices more than other sectors. And it's not going to start a competition between firms, because there's like a tacit understanding that all the firms from that sector can operate in the same way and increase their prices. And this creates like a temporary monopoly power. Of course, for this type of conflict, and also for other conflicts, once the conflict is triggered on a specific level, like in this case from between firms, then it can also have a consequence on the other conflict. So workers-firms conflict could start once this one is already operating. So another part of the literature also talks about the size of the firms, and tries to stress that big firms will always have more power to protect their profits and increase prices compared to small firms or medium-sized firms. They will always have more capital, more liquidity, and more power to act. And finally, the last type of conflict is the conflict between financial and non-financial sectors. And we refer to it also as conflict between capital owners and other groups, or between creditors and debtors. And this conflict, maybe the more most theoretical one to explain, but it's the one that depends on the fact that who controls the finance, who can control the interest rate and the monetary policy, they can also influence the cost for all the other groups. So some authors refer to it also as a conflict between rentiers and non-rentiers, and so it could be a conflict between rentiers and firms, when the rentiers are trying to take one part of profits from the firms, at the expense of the firms, of course. Then it could be a conflict between rentiers and workers, if the rentiers are increasing, like borrowing prices for workers. And it can also, of course, trigger other conflicts once this conflict starts. And whoever studies or deals or interprets this kind of relation or this kind of conflict is very, very concerned with interest rates and monetary policy. And then there's some understanding, at least in some of the papers and some of the contribution, that central banks, as they have the power of changing interest rates, they kind of operate in a way that they can induce the fear of loss of income on other groups, so on workers and firms, to make always sure that they do not use too many of expansionary policies, and that the economics is always not too overheated, let's say, so there's not too many pretenses, let's say, from the workers and firms. And there's also this understanding that whoever controls the interest rates also controls the redistribution of income, and it's always in favor of the rentiers. Okay, maybe I run through it. I hope you got at least some ideas of what were the main options. But this was the exercise, trying to propose a novel classification of the causes of inflation of heterodox in the way to help us reorganize heterodox literature. And the main things that we learned, let's say, is that these conflicts that were at the center of our exploration can have varying intensity. So they are not always the same, they are not always valid at the same time. Sometimes they can disappear and reappear in different timelines, and sometimes they can overlap. Some example of this could be that workers and firms conflict was much more important in the 60s, 70s, 80s, but maybe less today. But the firms workers conflict, so it was relevant again after the pandemic inflation, as the firms were getting more market power, while the domestic agents and foreign agents conflict was very important in the 70s and the 80s with the oil crisis and all the supply shocks, but also it was very important in the most recent inflation because of many elements. Workers and workers, for sure, it was much more important when there were more trade unions and workers had more bargaining power, while firms and firms, it was again super discussed and super important very recently, a couple of years ago. So is also the conflict between financial and non-financial sector. Each time we have to do something with monetary policy decision and things like this. So by applying this framework, we can draw some few fundamental conclusions. Yeah, so if you go away today from the seminar and you are like, whatever, she talked about different squares, different conflicts, everything is a conflict. But what I really want you to get out of this is the introduction of the messy Phillips curve and all the not very clear ideas of where it's going was to bring us also to compare it to the heterodox world. And the interesting part about the heterodox interpretation is that they really give you a plurality of explanations. So they look at the things that have impact on the labor market or on the power of firms, that they describe the country's position in respect of the rest of the world. So there's all these elements that they consider either in theoretical works or empirical works. So it's a very rich discussion. The second thing that I would like you to take away from today would be that none of these conclusions are country-specific or time-specific. None of the contributions are pretending that their results will be valid forever. There is this awareness that it could be applied to an historical period or to a specific region, but it's not always valid in any situation. And maybe the third element is that this gives us an understanding that there could be a plurality of inflation regimes as a conclusion of these ideas, and that some drivers can be more intensive or less intensive in different periods. So just I'll take 5 more minutes before concluding, because I think I'm still good on time, yeah? And just to say that what did we do with this? Like, this is very nice, but it's very theoretical, and if I didn't give you any ideas of where to go from this, you would be like, okay, nice, she read lots of articles. But I think it was actually very interesting, because now whenever there's a news on the newspaper or whenever I'm reading an article, like, it's very easy for me to position and categorize where, how to think about this problem, how to think about a specific cause. And on the other side, this gave me also the inspiration of how to look at it empirically, because many authors, as I told you, recognize the limit of the Phillips curve and went to look at different explanatory variables. But not many authors, even in heterodox contributions, actually did something about this time variation. The fact that these conflicts change over time, that the variables change their effects over time. So from my slides, it's not super clear, but what I tried to do was to use like an innovative econometric technique to try and to look at some of the main variables and look how their impact on inflation changed over time. So it was done on 7 or a subset of 15 countries, but again, I'm not going to present you all the presentation and all the results. It's just to give you an idea what can you do with this and where did I go with this. And I wanted just to present shortly this table, and then I promise I'm done. And this is a heat map, and what you see, it's 4 different relationships. So it's always the impact on inflation of import prices, nominal exchange rate, unemployment, and union density on the right corner, bottom corner. And the heat map shows you the lighter colors whenever the impact is higher, and darker colors whenever impact is lower. So as inflation historically was much stronger in between the 60s and the 80s, you see that the yellow is always on the bottom of the graph because there was more inflation. And then in the most recent years, there was again inflation, but it was lower compared to the historical periods. What I wanted to highlight, and then we can conclude, is that the top 2 graphs, heat maps, are completely different from the unemployment one. That is the one in the left corner, because you could see that each time that the level of import prices or nominal exchange rate increases, the value associated to the impact on inflation also changes and increases. So more import prices were changing and increasing, more they were causing inflation in the past. While it's very interesting to come back to the Phillips curve, that the part that talks about unemployment, it's one straight line for the inflationary period. So it didn't matter which level of unemployment you're looking at, the effect is always the same on inflation, which doesn't mean that there is an effect. That just means that there was inflation. And super interestingly, the last bottom right heat map shows you for the data for union density, and you can actually see that the highest the union density rate was, for every increase in union density rate, you had much more higher and powerful explanation of inflation in that moment. And maybe last things is that as you go higher with years, so in more recent inflation, you can see that very few of them actually can explain the most recent inflation, and maybe the exchange rate and the import prices are the ones that go towards the yellowish orange, but not much more. And of course not union density, because union density has decreased so much that it cannot play a role anymore. Okay, I'll go back and say that's enough for today.